So the theme we're moving on to now is essentially museums meet the senses. Now you might know, you might think, well, that just doesn't work, but we're going to try and persuade you that perhaps it does, and perhaps there's some problems along the way. I should start by introducing the team here, including myself. So I'm Robin Skeets from Durham University. On the one hand, I'm an archaeologist, and I work in caves where the sense of sight it really is rather downplayed, and the other senses come to the fore. On the other hand, I work on museum and heritage studies, and at the moment I'm interested in what makes people go wow when they visit archaeological sites and landscapes. But looking to my colleagues here, so in order, I think now, because I did impose that, it may change as we go along. But Kathy and Beatrice from the Museum of London on my left, and then on my right, Carlos and David from the Centre for Contemporary Culture in Barcelona, and then Rita and Sasha from the City Museum of Cologne. So welcome to all of you. And indeed, without further ado, really, over to you. We're going to have about 7.5-minute presentations from each, to be precise. But also, I'd like 5 minutes or so of discussion after each pair of presentations, because each pair is from the same institution. So, over to you, Kathy.
Does it work? Yeah, that's fine. I'm going to stand up here just to do the slides. As Robin said, this will be very quick, so I just want to give you a few sort of basic things to think about from my own perspective of taking part in these fantastic workshops, and then Beatrice will talk a little bit more about the future. So what I really want to say is 5 things about what connects these 3 words, museum, city, senses. And 3 of these things suggest that these 3 words go together beautifully, that museums are absolutely in sympathy with cities and senses. And there are 2 sort of areas of problems. So it's 5 things we're going to look at. Does this work? Now, the first reason why museum, city, and senses go together is that museums have always been places of emotion. And in the workshops, it was one thing we did talk about at some time, is the connection between the senses and emotions. Now, you might think that the emotional side of the museum is quite a recent one, but it's not. These slides are from the London Museum of 1912. It's about 100 years old. And when it opened, it was much criticised for generating emotions, things like nostalgia about these penny toys, and not being sort of quite scientific and pedagogic enough. And it generated emotion both on the personal level. There was a lot of sort of social history items. And also it was consciously trying to generate sort of, at that time, patriotism, a sort of patriotic emotion. So museums are places of emotion. So that makes them very well suited to doing things about the senses. Now, the second thing that makes museums, well attuned to the senses is that our collections are physical things, or most of them are, and traditionally have been. So these are things that are, that you can touch, you can feel, they're haptic, and to really understand things like these baker's tools up there, you really have to have some sense of how they're used, what they feel like in the hand. And in other ways, I mentioned before, the sort of emotions of nostalgia. We've got a lot of things in our collections that generate feelings of sort of love, sort of affection or memories from people. So our collections are a sort of great asset in dealing with the senses. The third thing is that museums are very flexible institutions. Although we've been around for hundreds of years, the idea of a museum has changed enormously. And in many ways, I think Astrid said this morning that history, you can make it what you like. It's the same for museums, actually, that it's an institution with stuff in, and it's a public space, but you can sort of display things differently, you can collect different things. And certainly today, of course, museums are very different from even when I went into museums about 30 years ago. And I think it's true that today's museums are much more attuned to ideas of the senses than they were. And this is partly because we are much more aware of communicating to the visitors. So displays such as this, which is the Museum of London's Capital City display put up in 2010, most of the debate about curating the content was about how it could be audience focused. So although this might look like quite a traditional museum display, there are things to touch, to feel, there are things for different visitors, there are things designed to prick the emotions, there are things designed to be a bit more intellectual. And we think very, very, in terms of sort of public space, and of course the museum is a sort of public space, the amount of discussion and debate and the sort of negotiation of power relationships that goes into sort of making a space as it is unbelievable. This is why museums take so long to put on displays. So we have to sort of take account of our visitors, and obviously taking account of how people understand through the senses as well as just through the intellect is very much a part of that. So those are the things that make museums very sort of, on the side of thinking about the senses. And I should say at this point that there are probably two ways into this debate for museums, that we are public spaces in our own right. We create our own little form of public space, so we have to think about the senses. But also the public space that we create has to have some connection to, if you like, the real public space of the city. And if you're a city museum, that's obviously true. That although we're imagining and constructing our view of, the city, it has to bear some sort of credibility in terms of what the visitors understand as the real city, if that made sense. Now, why are we not so good about doing the senses? Well, there are two things to think about here. One is the word permanence, and museums are very big on things being permanent. So some of the displays are permanent, in that we can't afford to redo them, and also our collections. We are collecting for the long term, so we want our objects to have long-term value. And I think this does sort of make collecting things to do with the senses, which almost by definition are quite sort of ephemeral, or your experience of the senses are ephemeral, quite problematic. It's not difficult and it's not impossible, obviously, but problematic. The other issue is sort of universality, in that we're very keen now, most museums are, about collecting things that represent individual experience, oral history being a very good sort of case in point. But the challenge for museums is how to make the individual testimony or the experience speak to a wider audience. So it's not just about one particular person or one particular person's experience. And certainly oral historians have a long history of trying to present their collections of oral history in ways that are meaningful for people who bring different sorts of experience to the museums. So permanence and universality are things that sort of mitigate against museums doing things with the senses. But nevertheless, we do try, and I think one of the things I've learned from this workshop is that although museums using senses to interpret more sort of intellectual historical stories to various different sorts of audiences, what we haven't done so much of in the past is look at the senses as a subject in their own right and how that engages with the city. So now I'm going to hand over to Beatrice, who's going to talk about how the museum might do that in the future.
Yeah, so the reason I was so lucky to be part of this project is because I was very much sent off to think about what we're going to do in the new museum, and a lot of you will know that we're going to move to West Smithfield. We're meant to open our doors there in 2022, so it's not very much time in museum terms. So what I was sort of thinking about in terms of the two main ways, in my view, how museums can sort of engage with the senses. One way is sort of documenting and recording what's actually the experience now. And sort of related to that is sort of helping people to do stuff like we've just done now, is sort of experience the city in a sense where I think of the other senses that many people sort of underuse. So that's sort of one way, but I don't want to talk about that too much. The documenting in itself is a sort of big problem, as we've discovered in our workshops. The other thing, of course, is then how do you represent sensory experiences of the past? Or sensory experiences now in the sort of museum context. So I'm the fashion curator, or one of the two fashion curators at the Museum of London, and I sort of keep telling people that I'm really interested in the noises that clothes make or not make. At the moment, we sort of, a lot of us wear clothes that are actually very quiet. My shoes today are very squeaky, but you won't hear it because it's quite loud here. But that I think there could be something interesting about that, because a lot of the time when we show objects, we might show sort of tools or stuff that were used in a workshop. Then we might film someone using these tools, so you can sort of see how they touch them and you can hear the noise they make. But with clothes, we haven't sort of done that. So I'm sure there are a lot of objects in our collections that are maybe now silent, but they would make a noise if we let them make a noise, and sort of how to deal with that. And just another sort of small example, well, maybe two, sort of Astrid talked about sort of rereading things or close reading things. And I think a lot of, say, the oral histories we have could sort of be looked at again and just sort of pick out what people say about their sensory experience of the city. And also, when we do oral history now, we maybe should ask about that a bit more. We often sort of ask, how did you feel, but not how did it sound, or how did it feel in terms of how did you touch it, or something like that. So, but I'm sure there is a lot in the oral histories that we have that we just haven't picked out. And generally also fictional and other accounts of the city pay a bit more attention, not just about what they say about what St. Paul's looked like, but maybe the noise the crowd made when the Lord Mayor drove past in his wonderful golden coach. And lastly, I think one thing, we were asked a few times during the course of this project how it has changed what we're doing, and I said a few times it's been life-changing, and I kept saying, I don't mean that flippantly or ironically, it really totally has changed how I see the world. I just forget it occasionally. I don't always pay attention to all the senses, and I don't have a very good sense of smell, which is a problem. But what really struck me in Barcelona was a talk about working with homeless people and how there is a lot of perception that they smell, and that sort of keeps people from going near, and that's, of course, a wrong perception a lot of the time. And also that migration brings sort of new smells. And I think migration is something, of course, very much a thing it's very much in people's minds at the moment. Very much in my mind. I've been here since '89, and I haven't felt like a migrant for the last 15 years or so. But the last year, I really, really have felt like a migrant again. And so I think that there's something there that we don't talk about that well, I think, at the present museum. All the input migrants had in the creative life and all sort of other areas, but not just talk about the objects, but also sort of other things to do with migration. And I will finish in a second, but it's sort of thing that sprang to mind was that there is this quite famous Hogarth painting where the French people come out, Huguenots come out of the Soho French church, and they sort of conform to the typical idea of French people at the time in the 18th century. They look foppish and effeminate and a bit weird. And they would have definitely probably sounded differently, and sort of thinking about sort of the other things as well. But obviously that is sort of very dangerous territory to get onto potentially. You don't want to have sort of days when you can smell a migrant or something like that. But there's sort of other senses of experience of the other that we sort of don't talk about much in the museum. It's maybe might be a useful thing.
Brilliant, that was excellent. Thank you both very much. So what I'd like to do is just jump around a bit. So I'd like to give you the opportunity to offer comments even at this stage, and then we'll have some more comments afterwards. And we've been through a good range of themes already, from museums as public institutions, to visitor experiences, to collections and their sort of hidden histories, to city history making and representation, sensory experiences, and also the professional constraints of just how much of a sensory kick can you really deliver in a museum. But perhaps I might start off by asking you a question. What might you offer our two curators here for the new London Museum? What kind of a museum do you want then them to deliver for you as people visiting or living in London? What kind of a city history museum do you want from the Museum of London in a few years' time? Any thoughts? Any advice? Please.
It's just been touched on. Homeless show that London has had, and most probably always had, homeless.
Okay, that's one theme. Thank you very much. Yes, and Museum of London has been good actually in talking about diaspora and so on in the past, and the sheer melting pot of London over history. More questions. One at the back, please. Hand still up. Yes.
I suppose one of the things that interests me is just we didn't talk about senses, and particularly when you're impaired. So what we're losing a lot in London is all the public toilets, partly because of the sensual issue, the smells around them, but they were such an important part of public life, and the smells around them. And one of the issues for me is that we don't appreciate smells in the urban environment. They're sort of considered a sort of a more natural thing that we're looking for, but actually there's so much in the urban environment in terms of our senses that we kind of try to dull down.
Please.
On the back of that is the network, the water and sewage network is Victorian, and I know there's huge work going on with the Victorian mains renewals. So someone like Thames Water may have historic information or pieces which would include smells that could be included, because I'm sure they'll have taken the pipes out instead of just destroying them. They're part of history. It might be something that could be preserved, that you could still get the smells, or can the smells to do it.
I mean, in that example, there's also the potential of the museum coming to, the sewage network, the underground of London as well. Excellent. Okay. Please.
I think maybe something about the urban-rural divide would be really valuable, especially how that is seeping into our politics and our identity in a lot of ways. And I think understanding that divide, not just from a historical, political, migrational perspective, but also from the perspective of how it feels and how you can sense it. And I mean, what you were talking about, the smells of the city kind of being seen in a negative way, whereas the smells of the countryside are seen as cleaner and fresher and more enjoyable and things like that. So trying to disentangle some of that a bit would be really interesting to me.
Mm-hmm. Great. Heaps of, please, at the front here. Heaps of scholarship on different senses of time between rural and urban and so on. Please.
Just as people were talking, I remembered reading an article about how on housing estates, light plays such a big role, and darkness is now something that's really, a privileged thing to have. And I'm wondering if there's some way to kind of capture, but not just light and dark, but also sounds and smells over time in some sort of experience. I know I've been in museums before where, there's a room and you can sit in it and there's sound everywhere and you can capture, Mozart's music, what it sounded like when he's practicing in his room, or, the sound of a party at a certain time. And I wonder if there's something there that you could capture urban inequality through, whether it's light or dark, sound, smells, something that could be a somewhat immersive experience.
Thank you. One more word of advice and then we better move on.
London's always being knocked down and rebuilt, so construction materials, and especially, please, fresh set ferroconcrete. It smells beautiful.
The lunch. Right, final word for you two. Do you want to respond to any of that?
Briefly, I think we definitely should capture things now that we can then use in the new museum. What I'm not so sure about sometimes, we have this Victorian walk where I think there are sort of horses' hooves on cobblestones, and this sort of, for me, I'm very old-fashioned though, that it's sort of quite slight Disneyfication, which I don't like, but I've been told repeatedly they're very, very popular with our visitors, and we kept the Victorian walk when the museum was sort of redone because it would have been outcry otherwise, probably.
And I'd echo that, particularly with smells, actually. And I don't know of any museum which has done smells well. And I think the problem, if smells are done badly, is that it becomes a novelty that just doesn't work, and it can be absolutely awful. And I'm sure technology will, improve it at some time. But I think smells is, there you come up against the limitations of the display mode, if you like. Smells are really, really difficult.
Brilliant, thank you very much. Okay, so we move on swiftly now to Carlos. Over to you.
Sure. Hello. Okay. So my presentation is going to be quite straightforward. We had a set of questions that we were asked to answer, and I'm just going to kind of respond to them in order, and my colleague David will be a little bit more original. So the first question that we were asked was, why are the senses important for museums and museums for the senses in the city? And so from the outset, I should say that I'm not a curator myself. My participation in the Sensory Cities project on behalf of the CCCB, the Center for Contemporary Culture of Barcelona, has largely been in my role as a project coordinator and drawn from my background in urban sociology. So that's kind of where I'm entering this from. Having said this, I am a person who's interested in what institutions do and what they mean. And I do work at a museum that is interested in the city specifically, and that approaches its role as a museum from a little bit of a different perspective. We curate a lot of debates. We host a lot of like in-house projects. We do it more from this approach. Although there's also a part that does exhibitions and more from the contemporary art kind of angle. So I begin my answer to the question of why the senses are important for a museum with a previous question, namely, what kind of an institution is a museum, and what does it do for the place it inhabits? And there are many answers to these questions, and surely the curators, the real curators that are here, can answer them much more rigorously than I can. All I can offer is kind of an outsider's insight. I think to a great extent, museums deal in sensory experiences. I mean, that's what we do, and we also confer value upon them. The robustness of that sensory experience is perhaps what leaves the strongest impression on the visitor. A museum is a fixed place, but it aspires to take you to other places, other times, and other mindsets. And in that way, it is like the art that it contains. But the great advantage of a museum is that it is a relatively open space. And unlike novels, paintings, sculptures, films, or audio recordings, it has no real need to privilege one or two senses. It has a more complete and flexible palette of the sensory palette at its disposal to leave an impression on the visitor. So that's one of the major advantages we have. This makes a museum a privileged placemaker. And that translates not just to the museum itself and what it contains, but also to the area around the museum, right? Don't think I need to get any deeper into that. I think we know what I mean there. Whether we're talking about tourists or residents, visitors are always going to leave a museum with an impression of the city, whether they're visitors or residents of it, whether it's their city or one that they're just visiting and checking out. And so this puts a great deal of responsibility on museums to negotiate between two different and occasionally antagonistic sets of differences. And on the one hand, it must leave an impression of a city singularity on the visitor, right, and of the museum's singularity on the visitor. And on the other, it should avoid a certain parochialism, taking the visitor elsewhere, beyond the confines of the city and testing the city's limits. So the second question is, what are the big questions and challenges for the senses in the museum? And before this, I should point out, someone mentioned people that have certain sensory impairments. At the CCCB, one of the things that we do is we do organize tours for people that are for the blind or people who are deaf, that changes their interaction with the different exhibits that we have on display. I mean, the fact of the matter is that the way most exhibits are designed are around people who have a complete use of all of their senses, right? So that forces us to rethink a little bit how we approach a given exhibit. Beyond that, one of the most common criticisms of museum, and especially contemporary art museums, is that they are aseptic spaces. The stereotyped white wall and empty space image of a contemporary art museum is not much different than that of a sensory deprivation chamber. In most cases, I've heard this criticism in the context of a sort of celebration of the authenticity of art that inhabits less institutional or even informal settings. But instead of rehashing old discussions about high and low art or little and big C culture, a sensory perspective allows us to approach the Contemporary Art Museum with another set of questions. What questions emerge when we understand the museum's aseptic qualities as a sort of openness or potentiality, as an opportunity for object-oriented contemplation that filters out sensory stimuli and foregrounds the visitor's experience? What if the museum is an opportunity to see, listen, smell, touch, and taste itself? Not taste itself. I list these senses in order of the proximity involved between the visitor and the object. To see or to listen, these are not really much of a problem for a museum, but they are the senses favored by museums historically and in our present time. But the latter three, these involve a little bit more risk. Much has been made about the ability of smells to trigger memories. This makes it a very difficult thing to curate indeed, because people react to smell so strongly and so differently. Its invisibility renders it so elusive that what is pleasurable for some might be disgusting for others. And it is not for nothing that this may be the sense most commonly described as overpowering. Touch, on the other hand, puts the object itself at risk. It involves a great deal of trust in the visitor, and presently, museums generally don't trust them enough to touch the cases containing the object on display, much less the object itself. And finally, taste essentially involves making the object on display part of the visitor, such that the visitor leaves the museum with a part of the exhibit in them. But let's take a step back for a moment. Triggering memories and emotions, trusting the visitor, and becoming a part of the experience. Aren't these what a museum should seek to do? When we prohibit these senses, especially out of an aversion to risk, aren't we limiting the human experience we seek to elevate? Can the museum be a space that extends our appreciation of sensory objects by extracting them, albeit briefly, from their otherwise mundane surroundings? The third question was, how can the senses be used for curating important urban themes, past and present? David will, I'll try to wrap it up quickly. David will kind of touch on this a little bit more. All I'll say is that urban settings are generally noisy, and they blur the line between spaces of work, play, transit, rest, and contemplation. Depictions of the urban tend to rely on sensory juxtaposition. I can think of no better example of this than the aesthetics of so-called urban music. Try imagining hip-hop without thinking of concrete, graffiti, or a specific fashion sense. Why is this so? Perhaps it's because the urban, perhaps it is because the urban is, in reality, quite uniform. In The Rise of Urbanization and the Decline of Citizenship, social ecologist Murray Bookchin associates urbanization with the smothering traits of anonymity, homogenization, and institutional gigantism. He puts urbanization at odds with the city, which he relates in contrast with human propinquity, distinctive neighborhoods, and humanly scaled politics. I'd like to think that the senses are the key to engaging with that human propinquity. What Bookchin mentions is at once so crucial to the city and so threatened by the urban. So let's go back to urban music, for example. That style of music which all sounds the same to outsiders. Sure, the machine-assisted rhythms are generally constructed around a relatively finite set of tempos, but even a cursory listen reveals countless hyper-specific details, so thoroughly tied to a place that Bourdieu's points regarding distinction seem almost redundant. Accents, street, and personal names, fashion decisions all combine to produce a certain singularity. So to answer the question in a single sentence, it is primarily through juxtaposition and sensitivity towards obscured, seemingly mundane distinctions that the senses can be used to curate urban themes. And just a final point on interdisciplinarity, which was the next question. One of the challenges of the senses is that it actually forces us to be interdisciplinary. You can't talk about the senses because without an interdisciplinary approach, because you can come at it from so many angles, you can't even demonstrate how people experience the senses internally, that you need a wide variety of approaches to actually get to any meaning. And that reveals a lot of things about the social sciences, a lot of things about social practices and cultural practices that I think are really, really interesting and that the senses put us in touch with. So, thanks.